Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where my U.S. light infantry troops are trying to hold out against the armored mass of the Soviet hordes at the Bandar Abbas airport in usually Hapless's Persian Predicament scenario. Here we are, following the flight of a tow missile from the southwest Overwatch hill towards a BTR in Airbase South, where I have teams in two different buildings trying not to get overrun. This forward observer team is taking incoming fire from multiple Soviet infantry teams, including one that is advancing towards them. Another US team is here, and it fires two laws at a BTR as it comes into their line of sight. Both laws miss, but hit the building that my observer team is in. Seconds later, Specialist Isom's tow arrives at Airbase South, barely misses the BTR, and then also explodes into the observer team building. The tow actually wounds the observer, and the three explosions leave the team pinned. But they do hold it together long enough to break the Soviet team that was advancing on the building. And then a few seconds later, the team with the laws fires their last one and takes out that pesky BTR. That wild series of events happens on turn 13, but let's back up and put everything into context. First of all, I assume everyone who is watching this is familiar with the usually hapless scenario. If not, you should watch the video linked in the description to get map and scenario background information. I will only briefly say that I have a veteran light infantry company with only 3 Dragon launchers to start the game, and I later get 3 tow jeeps and 2 more Dragon teams as reinforcements after turn 10 and 2 F4s after turn 15. My light infantry are tasked with holding this mostly flat airfield against a Soviet force of 7 BRDMs, 6 BTRs, 7 BMTs, and 3 T-72s. As if that wasn't enough, the Soviets also have 6 120mm mortar teams with a total of 306 HE shells and 84 smoke rounds in support. This scenario is set up where the key to a US victory is holding the center objective completely free of the Soviets. So I briefly considered a complete turtle strategy around the center objective. But I dismissed that approach because 1, I don't really think it will work, and 2, it seemed really boring and contrary to the spirit of the scenario. So I decided to start the game with a full push into Airbase South, using all 4 jeeps I start the game with, and setting up 2 of my 3 mortars in this exposed forward area, hoping to catch my opponent's first wave of infantry as they exit their vehicles. The 3rd mortar is in the jeep in the foreground and will set up behind the little hill with a view down the road. US jeeps are probably the fastest units in the entire game, and I am able to drop off some teams into buildings inside the objective. And then 2 of the 4 jeeps race away to get reinforcements, while my mortars splash down in the path of the Soviet first wave. But the mortars cause no casualties. As turn 2 ends, a 7-man half squad gets caught on the runway by some BRDM fire, and instead of continuing a few more steps to the safety of the buildings, they gather into a ball on the smooth pavement. Needless to say, they suffer a mass extermination on turn 3. 900 meters away, their buddy with a Dragon attempts to take vengeance, but my precious Dragon, which I really wanted to save for BMPs and T-72s, splashes into the dirt a mere 600 meters short of the target. So I put short armored arcs on my 3 Dragon teams, and I will make sure not to fire from inside a building. Turn 4 goes better for our US troops, as a team with a law does manage to take out that BRDM that murdered my guys on the runway. And then a different team takes out a BRDM at 100 meters that was pushing forward into the south objective. Turn 4 ends as a light machine gun team and a fire support team load into jeeps for the unenviable task of reinforcing Airbase South. On turn 6, we get a BRDM kill from a rifle grenade. And then on turn 7, The Airbase South reinforcements arrive. The LMG team gets unloaded into the nearest empty objective building, but I decide to try to move this Jeep behind the low undulating hills into this building on the edge of the southern objective. The Jeep navigates to the building without being fired upon, unloads, and the observer team makes it into the safety of the building with only suffering a minor wound. The Jeep gets spooked and backs into the line of sight of a BRDM and is quickly destroyed. But the observer team manages to ambush a pair of Soviet infantry. The team does survive for another 3 turns, so I'm going to count that as a successful delaying tactic. I'm also showing a close-up of my mortar splashes. I've been trying to predict where some exposed Soviet troops will be, and as far as I can tell, my mortars have had very little success causing casualties. Here you can see I was expecting more movement towards the buildings in the objective, but instead the Soviets are running towards the hangars. Unfortunately, all of this comes to an end when the mortars are spotted and gunned down. I knew when I placed these teams forward, this would probably be the end result, but it still pains me when it happens. Progressing to turn 9, the horror you're about to see is why I decided to make this video. Because if I tried to tell my wife that 6 of my US teams fired 13 laws at a fast-moving Soviet BRDM at 130 meters, she would not be sympathetic. But someone viewing this will surely understand my shock and pain at watching my irreplaceable laws being wasted with such futility. And after that, on turn 10, I put short target arcs on all of my troops, but Sergeant Bill decides that he knows better and fires an even more important dragon at this same BRDM. Of course, the dragon misses, but Sergeant Bill does manage to wound one of his own squad mates with the backblast. My much-needed anti-armor reinforcements arrive on turn 11. Tow Vehicle 1 moves to the corner of the first building and immediately spots and destroys that BRDM that dodged all my laws in one dragon. But the CM gods were laughing as the wheels suddenly fell off Tow Jeep number 2 45 seconds after arriving on this map. And the gods continued laughing as Tow Jeep 3 sets up position on top of the berm between the walls, only to find out that the bushes block line of sight from here to everything. On the other side of the map, another round of Soviet reinforcements arrive, including 3 trucks with 120mm mortars unloading in the line of sight of my last 81mm mortar. Meanwhile, the battle for Airbase South continues as Soviet infantry advance upon the east group of hangar buildings where a lone broken and surrendering GI remains. That second row of hangar buildings provides a great opportunity for a reverse slope-like defense position, so I sprint a light machine gun team into those buildings. The light machine gun team makes it into position, and with 2 squads in the west hangar buildings, my guys take out 2 Soviet infantry teams. But it is hardly going well in this objective. The Soviets are using their enormous mobility and armor advantage to spread around Airbase South, and even though I'm able to take out a couple more armored vehicles, a BTR here on turn 11 by a 2-man fire support team, and a BRDM here on turn 13 by an infantry team firing all 3 of their laws, I won't have enough anti-tank weapons to actually stop the Soviet push. That being said, help is on the way. 1 4-man scout team with 3 laws in a Jeep. Unfortunately, they won't arrive in time to save the light machine gun team in the hangar or the forward observer team in this building. Both of those teams get wiped out on turn 15. As turn 15 ends, the lone scout team waits behind a sand dune, ready to sprint to the backside of Airbase South and hopefully cause more disruption in the Soviet plans. Before I show that, I will back up and show what has happened in the middle of the map, which is where the CM points battle will actually be won or lost. One tow jeep made it to the northwest Overlook Hill and has had limited success. This is the tow that missed the BTR at Airbase South on turn 13, but on turn 14 it destroys a BTR that is pushing west in the middle of the map. Then on turn 15 it barely misses a BTR that is in the process of unloading infantry, and I suspect that miss will haunt me later. At the same time, a Soviet BRDM tries to unload infantry just north of the major objective, in front of the troops that recklessly fired off all their laws. Fortunately for me, they have better luck with their rifle grenades, and the Soviet BRDM and infantry team is eliminated. As turn 15 ends, a 120mm mortar lands on a roof right on top of 3rd Platoon's Dragon team. Fortunately for them, it is a smoke round. The Soviets have 6 on-map mortar teams firing, and 3 of those are in line of sight of my last remaining 81mm mortar at Airbase South. My mortar team takes out one Soviet mortar with their first shell, and then finally takes out a second Soviet mortar team 5 minutes later. I never get the 3rd mortar team on this side of the map before I have to reposition, and despite losing 2 of their mortar teams, the Soviets are able to lay down a fairly effective smoke screen over the main objective. On turn 19, taking advantage of that smoke, the Soviets move in with 2 BTRs and their corresponding teams and advance to one of the edge buildings where, for some reason that I still cannot grasp, I had no infantry waiting. I repositioned 3 teams to engage those Soviet troops, but 2 of my teams get immediately wiped out. The 3rd team does manage to take out one of the BTRs, but this is a terrible exchange for me, because one dug-in team is enough of a presence to cost me the game based on how the scenario points are calculated. I also move a Dragon team to the top of a building to take out the other BTR, and of course that Dragon hits a bush, and then the Dragon gunner dies from BTR machine gun fire. Even though the center objective is the most important for the CM points battle, the most fun part of the game continues to be at Airbase South, and it is time to rewind to turn 16, where we left off with a sneaking scout team behind the sand dunes with orders to race to the far side of the objective and try to cause more disruption in the Soviet advance. The scout team emerges from a shallow valley between the dunes and manages to get behind the cover of these 2 buildings at the back. On turn 17, the scout team successfully dismounts into the cover of the building as 2 Soviet teams pull back to engage them. My scout team takes out both Soviet teams, and then they fire a law that barely misses, exploding underneath this BTR. Of course, this scout team hasn't completely stopped the Soviets from advancing in other parts of Airbase South. A BRDM advances into line of sight of my lone Dragon team over here and is destroyed, but my infantry have to stay hidden from armored heavy machine gun fire as Soviet infantry fully occupies the first set of hangar buildings. And then the situation here gets drastically worse on turn 19, as 3 BMPs and a T-72 are spotted heading this way, while I am reinforcing with 2 jeeps. carrying a light machine gun team and the scout headquarters team. Not quite even reinforcements. And even though my Overwatch tow jeep manages to snipe the lead BMP en route, I can't stop the other vehicles, and my troops have no hope against this level of firepower. As seen here on turn 21, where my sneaky scout team gets reduced to one cowering soldier by 75mm HE. And here where a light machine gun team suffers from a blast of autocannon. Moving on from Airbase South, which is all but lost, and with only a slim hope of clearing all the Soviets from the center objective, there is another portion of this battle that is going mostly my way. That is the exchange between my Overwatch and the Soviet Overwatch. On the southwest Overwatch hill, I have 2 tows in jeeps, and also the 3rd tow that dismounted from the jeep that broke down on turn 11. The Soviets have 2 T-72s, 4 remaining 120mm mortar teams, and a varying number of armored vehicles. The Soviets did direct some mortar smoke and high explosives onto the hill, and it did cause 1 casualty on my stationary tow team. But other than that, my tow teams have had some good success. I've showed a couple of kills earlier, and to add to those, we landed a hit onto each Overwatch T-72. The CM gods were smiling on me here, as I was very fortunate to get a frontal T-72 kill from just 1 tow missile. The second T-72 hit was not so lucky, and just bounces off the front turret, which is the expected result. And then on turn 22, I destroyed 2 BMPs that were advancing. Unfortunately, my opponent stopped sending files and hasn't communicated with me, so that was the end of this game. Normally I wouldn't make a video about a game that didn't completely finish, but as I mentioned earlier, I started making this video after turn 9, and I didn't want to just scrap what I had already done. From my point of view, the Soviet player would have won if we had kept going. He was going to wipe out all my troops at Airbase South, and then he could have pushed into this northeast section of the center objective where he already had a bridgehead. I would have certainly caused more casualties, but those are irrelevant for the scoring of this scenario. Although it is always frustrating to have a game end like this, overall it was a fun little scenario. I'm not a fan of static attack defense games, but this was more like a Soviet probe with one objective outside of the US starting setup zone, and the ability of the US to maneuver some troops around with the jeeps, which was what I had the most fun doing. Anyway, thanks to Hapless for setting this up for the community. Thanks to all for watching, and until next time, happy gaming.